Good morning. Today is the 27th, April the 27th, and we continue on these meditations during this time of quarantine. And today I would like to read in Matthew chapter 9, verse 13. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, no sacrifice, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. This text comes from this chapter in Matthew chapter 9, where Jesus is eating it. He's at a banquet with his disciples. He's eating with Levi, who has just become his new disciple. Levi, also known as Matthew. So Matthew, it was a tax collector, and the tax collectors were not people didn't like tax collectors. For we could understand them why they didn't like tax collectors, because they were considered as traitors, because they got rich by working for the Roman Empire and taking money from his own people, their own people, often very poor people. They had to pay an amazing amounts of money to Rome, and it was actually an unfair thing. So Jesus called Peter, James, John, who were all fishermen, and now he just called from the same area. He called this man called Matthew, and Matthew is really happy to. We don't know what happens before Jesus called Matthew. If you watch the Chosen, you see that there is a story before that calling, but we could see Matthew wanting to know more about Jesus. And there were lots of things happening in this small place called Capernaum. Lots of things. The people he heard about Jesus, they knew. Surely knew what Jesus was doing. So Jesus has this feast, and he's there eating with these people. And there were lots of curious people coming as well, because Matthew invited his colleagues, all the tax collectors as well. And the religious people, they actually didn't like the tax collectors. They would actually put them on the same list as the prostitutes. They were considered as big sinners, as if there were small sinners and big sinners. They were considered as big sinners. People who actually who could be stoned like a prostitute would be. But Jesus is there sitting with these people and eating and enjoying himself, as he often did. His heart is full of love and grace. And then he heard what these religious people are saying to Jesus' disciples. They were surprised that Jesus, as a master, as a rabbi, as a teacher, was actually eating with sinners. And then Jesus is quoting Hosea, saying, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, no sacrifice." So when you go back to Hosea chapter 6, because this text comes from Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, when you go back to Hosea, you learn lots of things about grace. And you learn that God is a God of grace. As we understand, grace comes from this word in the Old Testament that means to stoop, to bend. It's a person who is superior, who is bending towards someone who is inferior, as Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 9. I came for people who were sinners. That's grace. Joel is saying that the same God that allowed some very hard things to happen to Israel, so they would come back to him, like this, maybe like what's happening today in the world with this virus. The same God that allowed difficult times for Israel is the one who is going to heal them. He's going to bind up their wounds. He will revive them. God will bind up their wounds. And to do that, he would have to bend towards these people. And that's what grace is doing here. When Jesus goes to Matthew's house, he's showing grace towards that man. Matthew doesn't deserve for the Son of Man, the Son of God, the Son of David, to come into his house and to eat with him. But grace does just that. He comes into our house, he eats with us. As Jesus says in Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, he's saying that to a church who actually thought they were too good. They didn't even need Jesus. And Jesus is telling that church that they actually need him because they are blind. And he's knocking at the door. Jesus comes down to knock at the church's door. And he's telling that church, I want to come in and eat with you. That's grace. He bends down towards us to help us. To help us. Sorry. And Paul says that Jesus, in Ephesians chapter 2, Jesus came down to take us from the tomb and to set us in the heavenly places. We are set with him there. But before we were down in a big hole, in a big well, and he came down to us. That's grace. So he came to save a people just like you and I, sinners. If we were righteous people, he wouldn't have come. And because he came, he is showing grace towards us. He came down to us to look for us.